Hi and welcome back to the GemHawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a lovely day today no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my Languorous Luna design. Now this is a frame filled in a cyclic nature, and I'll show you this on the board in just a moment. And to me it looks like a supine crescent moon just lazily floating on those clouds. So that's why I've called it the Languorous Luna. It teaches a couple of different techniques. One is to create a nice round frame, a good solid frame, and the other is the art of cyclic weaving. So let's head down to the board and I'll show you a couple of examples that I've made thus far, and then we'll work together to create our very own. This is the design that I'm going to be sharing with you today, and it teaches you how to create a good solid round form, and then we're going to add to around about 2/3 of that area, we're going to add on some beads, and then I will share with you how to create this lovely cyclic design to generate that lovely Languorous Luna effect. So I'm going to create this round form today. Now I'm working with 18 gauge wire, which is perfect for jewellery and wear because it's strong enough to create and hold a form, but light enough that it's not a drag to wear. This is obviously quite large, but it just is a little bit easier to show you on screen if I'm making a larger design. However, as an alternative to these, let's just pop that little chap up into the corner. You can add your own wire writing, so I've just put the word Luna in here, which is the name of one of my friend's children. Very, very pretty name indeed. So that's an option. You can add further decal to the side that you're not using any beads. Let's pop that out of the way. And then I made this one with just a scrap of wire, and I'm going to hang it like a mobile in my garden, and it will tip back because of the weighting of the design of the item. So it follows that same lovely cyclic pattern, uses just a scrap of that heavier wire. Now if you wanted to make this as a design for garden use, I would say probably use a heavier gauge wire, although I'm going to start today with around about 12 inches of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire. As I mentioned before, this is ideal for use in jewellery. Now the first thing that I will do is give that a lovely smooth warm through, just to make sure that it's good and fluid whilst it takes its form. Now you can make this really any size you fancy, but obviously you will need to up that length of wire if you're going to make a very large piece. I'm going to grab hold of one of my trusty wooden round bangle forms and just wrap the centre piece of the wire around, crossing those two ends over. And as you release it, it will grow somewhat from the size of the form that you have used. So obviously do try and make that a little bit smaller than the size that you want to end up with. You can, however, tighten it up if you need to. So if you wanted to make it exactly the same size every time and you have a form available to you, I'm just going to smooth those two ends down so that they sit against my round form for now. And that's approximately in the centre of the wire that we've created that round form. And then what I'll do is I'll turn a right angle with one of those ends of wire, and then the other one, what I'm going to do is grip that just where it crosses over the point at which I'd like to connect. I can release the block and then just bring that wire forwards a moment. So you end up with this sort of interlocking L shape. If I pop that back down onto the block, you'll see that it's just ever so slightly larger, but if you did want to make a repeatable size, you can achieve that just by working a little bit harder. Now if I bring those pliers back out of the way for a second, another way that you can help retain the size and shape that you're looking for is to leave the block in situation whilst you draw that tail of wire around, and it will slightly tighten up as you start wrapping the tail around that central core wire. So this is why I tend to teach putting a little bit of a kink in the wire just at this position so that you can hold that size and shape. However, I'm really happy with the roundness that we've achieved with that block, with that round form. So I'm going to remove that for the moment. What can happen when you bring this tail of wire over is that some of the wire creating the round form disappears and you'll end up with something slightly smaller. So if I just continue to wrap that around, I'll knock the camera obviously because it's me. You may not then be able to get it directly back onto the block. So when I've said to you before about maintaining the size and shape of a frame that you're creating, this is what happens. And I thought it was a really good idea to show you that today, just because it means that you can see in action what happens to the side of wire. It gets eaten up into that coil. So you can leave the block in place to retain the size. If you over tighten it, I'm just going to take that round a couple of times. I think I'll go for 5 times, so one more wrap up at the top there. What you may find is that it attaches itself to your block and you have to then prise it away. However, what happens during that process is that you get a slightly stronger circular form. So if you're making those Christmas baubles, as we explored together a few months ago, it's a really nice way to strengthen up the frame whilst you're going through that process. So all I'm going to do with the other wire just over here is to create a wrapped loop. Now we have done these together dozens of times, but I will just run through that very quickly. What you have the option to do at this stage is to double wrap the neckline here, or to leave a little bit of space of an equivalent size above your little coil, and that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm imagining that I'm going to repeat those 5 wraps, pop my pliers across and pull the wire forwards again. So then I will employ a round form or some bail making pliers to create a good shape. Just going to grab my marker pen because I can't find my bail makers. Create that round form, and then you will circle the wire around. Let's just pop that back over to the side to create that wrapped loop. Now you can obviously size that down, which is what I'm going to do because that's kind of large otherwise. Just manually adapting as you go and quite gently. If that isn't round enough for you, you can just grab a pen or a pencil or something. And then we're going to take that tail all the way around. Now you'll see here, this is another common problem when you're making a wrapped loop for a bail, is that your wire snakes too far down that core. So you can quite simply just push that back up towards the wrapped loop and use your pliers just to bring that back into form, and then you can commence wrapping around that core wire. And what we're looking to do is to get there to be no naked neck wire still left. We're looking to completely fill that section with wrapping. Now it's only tricky because I've got this sticky outy bit, so I'm going to just lift that up and bring those tails of wire all the way around until they meet in the middle. So keep going until you get a nice tight finish. So what I tend to do with a piece like this is grab a second flat pair of pliers just to support the round form up at the top, which will become your bail, and then I can use my pliers just to finish off that wrapping. So we should get a 5th turn of wire out of this, which should nicely fill the gap that we have left behind. Drawing it's quite cold here today, so you'll have to forgive my slow fingers. Turning that all the way around until you have filled that little gap with your 5 wraps of wire. So let's just turn that all the way over, and we would look to just neatly finish that off, push that into position. Let's get those pliers out of the way, and then draw that last little bit across into that gap at the back. So once you're happy with how that looks, you have an option with this tail of wire. A little bit later on you can turn that into a coil. I might just do that now so that it doesn't get in my way. So I tend to trim that down to around about 1 inch. I only want quite a small coil. That's probably just slightly longer. I don't have my ruler to hand. So I'm just going to rotate that around with my round nose pliers to generate a little coil. Now this is a frame that I make time and time again. This is where I will start when I'm making a tree of life design. Sometimes it's where I'll start if I'm making a dream weaver, my dream catcher inspired designs. And also if I'm setting an oversized cab and using netting, I will often create a frame in much the same way. So it's a multi-purpose, useful thing to learn to do well. And I will just give that a bit of a squish to make sure that it is nice and strong. So the next thing that we're going to do is choose our wire and beads to add on that basic array of beads around the side. So I have some little amethysts in a bag. These are around about 4mm. These little sparkly beauties are 3mm, but you can take it to slightly larger as well if you wished. You could go for really up to sort of 5 or 6mm. If you use beads that are very tiny, your cyclic weaving might fall off. So we don't want anything really, really small. These are 3mm rondelles, which work quite well. That's as small as I would go for this Languorous Luna design. So the next wire we're going to use, I've got an 18-inch length, which I cut for another project, of 0.4mm wire, which is equivalent to 26 gauge. And I think this is going to be a little bit long. So we'll see at the end how much we've got left, and then you can estimate from there. This is around about 2.5 inches across at this stage. So I'm just going to tuck one of the ends of the wire away under the desk, and I will start by flipping over. If you want your Luna to be on the left side, depending on whether you're waxing or waning, then you will just need to run this in the opposite fashion. What I'm going to do is sit it on the right hand side, and we will start by just flipping the section around, laying the first inch of that finer gauge wire over the top, and I want to wrap that around about 3 to 5 times to get a really good connection onto that frame. Now, to begin with, you can run that around by hand. Let's just flick that up into the light. Nice little coil of neat and tidy wires, but you will probably want to finish that off with a pair of flat facing pliers. I'm using my bent chain nose pliers, just so that you don't stab yourself in the thumb, which would be really, really rubbish. So I'm going to make sure that that's nice and tidy and tight, and I'm trying not to put any pressure on the form. I want to keep that nice and round, and I'll scooch that little coil until it sits quite close to, but not completely adjacent to, the little section that we wrapped together a moment ago together. I'm going to grab my first little amethyst. I believe these are 4mm beads. And we're going to find the very end of that wire now, which is slightly kinked. As I mentioned, I cut this for another project and then got distracted, you know, ooh, look, a squirrel, that kind of thing. If you've got a scraggy bit on the end, you can just cut that away, and I will melt that down later. So we have a slightly better end. And I'm not going to make you watch me try to thread beads for very many times today, because it's pretty terrible. So we're sliding that bead down into position, and it's now sitting against the frame wire. My little coil of wire is sat with the tail coming over the top of the design. If yours is coming from underneath, then you would probably find it easier just to sort of cut that and start again. So we're going to sit that bead against the outside of the frame, push the little coil quite close to that bail, and support the bead whilst we bring the entirety of the rest of that wire up into the centre and through. What I will do now is I will wrap 3 times around that frame wire, drawing the wire up through the centre each time, and then scooch that neatly into a tight little coil. I'm only going to do that one more time because it is painful watching me pop beads on, and then off camera I will continue to wrap those beads, 3 wraps of wire between each bead, keeping the spacing even between each of those beads, and I will continue 2/3 of the way around the length of the, is it called circumference? I'm not a mathsy person, I can never remember the terminology. So let's add a second bead. If I could see the hole, it would be super. Slide that down into position. Plop. And then supporting that bead against the outside of that frame, and you can stretch those apart ever so slightly, so you don't want them too close together, otherwise it will take yards and yards and yards of finer wire later, and you might not want to spend that much wire on a project. So what I'm looking to do is to keep an even spacing between each bead. Again, the finer gauge wire comes over the top of the frame, through the bead, support the bead against the outside of the frame, and then push the leading edge of the tail of the wire up inside that frame, and then repeat the same thing until you have 3 visible wraps. I'm going to leave those loops really, really open. The coils are far apart at the moment, so if I tilt that in the light, they will be picked up, and you can see the easy way is to just scooch those together and then apply just a tiny bit of tension just to tighten that up neatly. Again, I'm just going to pull the coil of wire ever so slightly over to the right because I want to keep my beads evenly spaced. So what I'm going to do off camera now is continue adding my little 4mm amethysts 2/3 of the way around. Now you can measure that or you can guess, it doesn't really matter. If you get to 3/4 rather, it'll be too full and your Luna will look quite pleasant anyway, but I found in the many, many iterations of this design that I made that 2/3 of the way around was ideal. Also, it's really helpful if you have an even number of beads. So you can either pre-count them. I think I used 16 on this design, or you can get to where you think it looks good, count your beads. If it's an odd number, simply add one more. One extra bead isn't going to make or break the design, but an even number of beads really helps the finish of that cyclic design. So I'll be back with you in just a second. So I have continued adding those beads all the way around the outside edge of my round frame, and I've used 14 4mm beads, and I only ended up using around about 10 inches of that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire, so that gives you an idea. This is again around about a 2.5 inch frame. So I'm going to take you back down to the board now and we'll work on creating that lovely cyclic weave. So here we have my little amethyst frame, and I'm going to work for the next part of the tutorial with my wire directly attached to the reel. So I'm working with round raw copper, as I very frequently do. I'm leaving the wire all the way attached across the board. I've unspooled about 2 foot of wire. That's where we're going to start off. And in this way you won't be cutting prematurely, you won't run out, or you won't have too much wire cut and therefore be wasting it. So we are going to start by winding on at the end where we got to adding those beads. It's around about 2/3 of the way around the complete circle frame. And again, we're going to lay that wire over the top of the frame, this time over the centre. And there's around about 3/4 of an inch just over the edge there, and I will make a really good, strong, solid connection around the frame again. And I'm going to start wrapping after my last wire has finished. So I'm not wrapping over the top because sometimes that gets a little unruly. I'm going to wrap a good sort of between 3 and 5 times around that frame again, as I did on the last bead. And exactly the same as before, if you have very tough fingers, you might be able to finish that by hand. But I would recommend using a pair of flat facing pliers. I've got my bent chain nose pliers again. I've had these for a very, very long time, almost 13 years now. So unfortunately, no, I don't remember where they were from. What I will say is I have a very similar pair in the other room that I got from Beadalon. No, I'm not on commission. They're just good pliers. So we have connected to the frame at the end where we finished with those beads. Again, I'm connected on the reel of wire all the way along. What we're going to do is make sure that our frame isn't floppy or floopy. And I'm just going to put a very little bit of warmth and heat through that first section of wire. What I want to do now is aim for the centre point along my beaded section. And this is the reason why I prefer to use an even number of beads. I used 14 in this design. So I'm going to count 7 along, and I'm going to aim the tail of wire that's connected to the spool after that 7th bead. So just checking, 7 either side, we're at midpoint, and I'm going to put a little bit of tension to that point. And what I'm going to do is rotate the frame around, draw the wire over the top of that point between number 7 and number 8, so the halfway point. And as I've drawn that over, I'm very gently just going to pinch that. And that takes the pressure off me for a moment. I can hold on to that. Tiny bit of warmth into the next piece of wire, the section that's underneath. Let me just flick that in the light. And I'm drawing that across the back of the frame now, in between the first and second bead. I'm going to do the exact same thing as I did before, which is to bring the wire, it's underneath at the moment, so bring it up between those 2 beads and across the face of the design. Whilst I've got a little bit of tension in that, I'm going to very gently pinch, and that puts a nice little angle in the wire at the end there. I'm then going to take the tail of wire to the next bead position, so you're always moving from point to point. So where we were after the 7th bead, we're now going to just after the 8th bead. So I'm going to flip the whole thing around, just stroke that until it sits in position, pinch as I draw the wire back down. And now instead of coming back to the first and second gap, I'm going to bring the wire across the back of the design between the second and third. So you're always moving one position around. Now, whichever way you tilt it, it's up to you, whatever works best for you. When you get into a routine, it's a really lovely, mindful exercise to do. So I'm going to create that pinch point, give it a bit of a squish, tiny amount of heat, and you can see that's too far forwards, That's repeating what we've already done. So we're going to the next available point between those two beads. I'm going to draw it around and just sit that over the top. You don't want to allow your frame to come out of shape. So just a little bit of a heat into the wire there and draw the wire back around. Now I'm going to speed this up, but the process is always the same. We're skipping from point to point, moving on one bead position at a time, and it is a lovely weave to get into. You are looking to have a little bit of, you're going to have a little bit of that tension as you pull the wire, but not so much tension that you draw the frame out of shape. So you can see this is where we came last time. So we're going to come up between these two beads now, and I'll just hold that for a second whilst I unspool another couple of feet of wire off the reel. And then I'm going to draw this back up to the next adjacent spot that's free, bring the wire back down. You can see where we've got to go to next. There isn't a stroke of wire there yet. So again, you will just keep going until I've run out of wire off the spool already. So let's just open that up, bring that back down, and you'll be around about 2/3 of the way around. Bring the wire up over the top for the last time, and you can just move that around if it's moved whilst you were doing a little bit of weaving. And what we're going to do is pinch that just in position and cut around about 3/4 of an inch past the end, and we're just going to wrap around just past that neckline section where the bail comes away from the design. So if you wish to, you can match that with the 5 wraps you've been doing already. So that's number 4. Bring number 5 over the top, and what I'd look to do is to try and trim that so that the end section is right inside the design, and give that a quick smooth down so that it sits flat. You can tighten that up. You can trim that way you please, but obviously if you keep that as neat as possible. And then I'm rotating the pliers around in quite a soft fashion. What that does is it just smooths the end down. So you can see this section, adding the beads, takes a little bit of time. But getting cracking with that weaving, that's a lot of fun, and it doesn't take very long at all. And you end up with this lovely, it's like a supine moon laying on its back, being just a little bit lazy, but in a good way. So let's just grab those other examples for you to see. You can add in writing in wire if you wish. You can just do a teeny tiny section that's a little moon all by itself. But that is the Languorous Luna cyclic weaving design. I'm going to play Tetris with them now, get them to fit together on the screen. I hope that you've enjoyed that. So here's the piece we've made together today with those little amethyst beads. You can make it with a bit more sparkle. These are some lovely check glass beads. Really pretty sparkle on those. You can go for that just sort of sectional design, just a little bit of a slice of a moon there, or you can enhance it further. That's going off to one of my friend's daughters in a little while. Thank you very much for hanging out with me today. I do hope you will join me again very, very soon. New YouTube tutorials are launched pretty regularly, Sunday at 4 PM British time here on YouTube. Catch up with me first Monday of the month on Facebook for a live crystal and gemstone sale, and I look forward to catching you all over the interweb. Take care. Bye for now.